Take 3. Hey internet. Before I get into anything else, I really need to give a quick disclaimer. Any comments or criticisms made in this review are specific to my experience as a free user studying the Korean course. Someone who's, say, a paid user studying French or Spanish or German might have a very different experience, so bear that in mind. I'm going to say a lot of negative things about the app in this review, but I want to start out with a few positives. I don't want to give the impression that I hate the app or that you shouldn't use it by being overly vitriolic out of the gate. This is a 1-year review after all, and I've been using it that long for a reason. I mean, for one, it's literally just an app on your phone. Just taking the train, getting a cup of coffee, just taking a 5-minute break from work. These all become super valuable study opportunities. The lessons are all in these bite-sized chunks that make your learning feel super manageable. Arguably most importantly though, it's genuinely fun to use. If you take nothing else from this review, just take the fact that after 1 year, I'm still having a lot of fun with it. Part 1. What is Duolingo? According to the webpage I have open in Safari right now, Duolingo is the world's best way to learn Korean. I'm sorry, but that's wrong. I hate to be so blunt about it, but it's just false. I saw a video recently talking about a book of poetry that had gained a bit of a reputation for being not great. The thing is though, from what I saw on the video, I actually quite liked a lot of it. If I'd seen those same poems in a scene, or just posted on the internet somewhere, I probably would have really enjoyed them. I think what rubbed a lot of people the wrong way was just the fact that it was in this expensive book. You can't give people a certain level of expectation and then expect them to not get mad when your product doesn't live up to it. Duolingo is an app/website designed to make it easy to incorporate language learning into your daily routine. It is not a comprehensive language learning resource, and I really hate that they market it as such. This is especially true for the Korean course, which lacks a lot of the features that other, more European-centric courses have. I think a lot of my early grievances with the platform could have been solved with just slightly more honest marketing. You can't just give people a certain level of expectation and then expect them to not get mad when your product doesn't live up to it. The first thing on the agenda for the Korean course is Hangul. And I hate these lessons. Going into the language, I knew next to nothing about it other than it shared a lot more in common with Japanese than it did with English. I'd studied a small amount of Japanese in high school, so I knew that it mostly used one character per syllable. The app started by showing me a character in Hangul, and then asking me to match it to characters in the Roman alphabet. There's a lot wrong with this approach, but at the time I didn't know any better. I distinctly remember seeing the character Byung, and wondering how I ever was going to remember that. It wasn't until considerably later that I realized it's just a B, a O, slightly modified to be a yo, and then an ng. Having acquired this newfound knowledge, I immediately just did a YouTube search for Hangul Guide, and immediately found a really great video from Billy Go Korean that gave me a proper full explanation, going over all its lovely, beautiful simplicity, but also all of the little nuances that you really just wouldn't pick up from seeing the characters and memorizing Roman alphabet equivalents. Having seen this and then going back to the app, I had a lot more success, but I didn't really feel like I was learning through the app as much as I was just memorizing the knowledge that I'd already found out through other sources. This kind of became a running theme. Part 2. What shape is your peg? One thing that became very obvious very quickly was that the app really feels like it's adapted for Korean rather than being built from the ground up for it, with all of the little nuances in mind. If you want to see the explanation for this, try and pronounce no luck. What if I told you it's pronounced? Yeah, it's not much help, I know.
못했어?
Unfortunately, Korean doesn't really map well to the Roman alphabet. It's very much its own beast and needs to be treated as such. It really needs to be engaged with on its own terms. This really conflicts with Duolingo's very hands-on learning, hands-off teaching approach. The basics of Duolingo's teaching style is to give you all the tools you need to figure things out for yourself, while explicitly teaching as little as possible. This sounds great in concept, getting people to make connections for themselves rather than just being told these seemingly arbitrary sounding concepts. But once again, it falls apart quite quickly. Letting people make connections themselves is fine when there's a direct analogous component in the native language, but most of the time these things don't map one to one. As an example, let's look at the Korean word do. Do translates to more, but whereas in English more is used to modify the noun, do is used to modify the verb. So whilst in English you might want to say, I want to drink more coffee, where more coffee is what you want to drink, a slightly more literal translation for the same sentence might be, drinking coffee is the thing I want to do more. 커피를 더 마시고 싶어. For this reason, I really can't recommend Duolingo as a primary language learning resource, at least for Korean. It's really great for keeping you motivated and lets you just squeeze study into times where you might not otherwise be able to. And I know there are more language learning resources on the desktop version, but even after using them and struggling with them for about a month, I just gave up and found other resources elsewhere and had much more success. I found it much more effective to just find comparable resources on websites specifically designed for learning Korean. Which begs the question, part 3. What is Duolingo? Again, according to me, Duolingo is a portable workbook with tailored exercises to help you fix your mistakes. I really need to make a distinction between textbooks and workbooks here. In very simplified terms, a textbook teaches you the content, whereas a workbook lets you practice the things your textbook taught you. In practice, a lot of learning resources kind of blur this distinction, but I still think it's an important distinction to make, as it's really important to understand the functions of the different resources you use. Don't study with Duolingo every day, and if I want to sit down for a serious bit of study, I would much rather sit down with a different resource, which leaves Duolingo basically there to fit in the gaps when I don't have time to sit down and study. Like, enjoy Duolingo as part of a healthy, balanced language learning diet. For me personally, I really like talktomeinkorean.com. Its curriculum is specifically structured for the Korean language, and it has a pretty wide variety of resources, from audio lessons and PDFs to videos and just people having conversations. I also watch plenty of study tip videos on YouTube, and I also do a lot of pen and paper study with textbooks. But net. So, is it any good? Now that we've figured out the app's function, at least for my usage, it's time to talk about how it actually performs that function. Unsurprisingly, now that we've significantly lowered our expectations, the app is much better at meeting them. It's not flawless at it though. There are still some big ways that I think it could improve. For one, Korean is a language that makes heavy use of conjugation, and it can sometimes be difficult to separate out the different parts of a word. I regularly find myself flipping between Duolingo and Naver Dictionary, just to try and figure out what the actual root of different words are. It would be incredibly useful to be able to see a full breakdown of the different parts of a word, rather than just a simple English translation. If at the end of every lesson I could actually see all of the vocabulary used, and all of the grammar structures, instead of just a screen trying to get me to buy a premium subscription, I would be a very happy learner. It's also really frustrating that I can't study a particular topic unless I've completed all of the prerequisite lessons, even if the particular thing I want to study is something that I'm already familiar with. As an example, talktomeinkorean.com introduced future tense much earlier in its curriculum than Duolingo. So I was essentially stuck just not being able to use Duolingo for that purpose, even though I was perfectly familiar and capable with understanding the lesson's contents, just because I hadn't studied a whole bunch of vocabulary for at school. It would also be really nice if they broke down the one big tree into separate trees for vocabulary, and grammar. Sophie, stop clawing. Cat's here. Having to study a whole bunch of vocabulary around going to school, which I do not do, just to be able to learn future tense, is really frustrating. In general, the app just has far too big of a focus on vocabulary and doesn't dedicate the time to teaching you how to use those words properly. These things all sound relatively small in their own, but really build up into making it feel like it's trying to shove this Korean-shaped peg into a European-shaped hole. I mean, sure, you can fit it through, but you might need some other tools to help it along. And final thoughts. I'm sure a lot of people will have clicked on this wondering, is Duolingo worth using? That's honestly a very easy question for me to answer. If you're asking yourself this question, I'd recommend giving it a download, at least just to try it out. Despite its many shortcomings, it's still a really useful tool that I use on a very regular basis. The more difficult question is, what do you expect the app to do for you? Whilst I've heard some people talk about using Duolingo as their primary resource, I really can't recommend that approach based on my own personal experiences. Duolingo's biggest flaw in my mind is trying to be an all-in-one tool that does everything without having the flexibility to be the tool you need it to be. My biggest recommendation would just be to search through a diverse selection of resources and find something that works for you. I know Lindy Buetes is someone with a very wide variety of resources on her website for a whole bunch of different languages, so I'll link that down in the description if you want resources. Duolingo may end up being a cornerstone of your study routine, or it might just be a way to cram in an extra 5 minutes on the train. If your goal is to just have some fun and learn something new, Duolingo might just be all you need. Whatever the case may be, just temper your expectations and be mindful of your goals. Oh, and happy language learning!